G'day, welcome to the Financial Bloke Podcast, the podcast for people seeking the wisdom needed to grow their family's wealth and live a happier, healthier and more prosperous life. My name's Ben Law and I am the Financial Bloke. John Moor is our guest today and is backed by popular demand. John's a highly experienced succession planning facilitator, and his episode number 24 was one of our most popular so far. Now, if you haven't heard it yet, go back and have a listen, as the feedback was absolutely amazing. Now, in this episode, which is part 2 of the Talking Succession 2-part series, we'll be focusing on the generation that are handing on the farm, or what we're affectionately calling the Oldies. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I'd recommend you go back and start there first. So now it's time to get on with part 2. Welcome back, John.
Thanks, Ben.
John, in your experience, we're talking to the older generation. Talk me through where they're at right now in your experience.
Ben, as a segue into that, in the previous podcast, number 24, the one prior to the young ones, I mentioned or said something there that I invariably never get a phone call from the older men in the family businesses. And I'm happy to report that Carl from WA phoned me and he said, John, I'm buggered if I'm going to be one of those guys, and here I am, I'm phoning you, and he's the only older generation man out of the 100-odd phone calls I've had who actually took time out, picked up the phone. So, Carl, if you're listening to this in WA, well done. Getting back to your question, where are the older generation sitting with us? They're sitting in a place of probably confusion and not knowing where to start, how to start, and a lot of the time why to start this conversation. Why do they need to have a conversation with the incoming generation? Because depending where they sit in the demographic, are you 55, 65 or 85? Because I've got some 75-year-olds who are the younger generation with a 92-year-old parent who's still alive who runs the show or controls the show or dominates the show. So it's a very wide category. But a lot of the older generation folks are sitting in a place of confusion, I suppose it is if it's gone too far, and the younger generation now is, as we said in the previous podcast, a middle-aged younger generation. Well, you've got a few things to work on there because you've let it go that far without having clarity. If they're the 20-year-old young ones coming through, it's easier to start the conversation, but invariably doesn't get held because the parents don't think it's necessary to speak to the younger generation when they're only 22 or 25, because you're the boss, you're in charge of the show, they basically are working for you. And we'll have this conversation with Jack or Jill when it's appropriate. And that date of appropriateness never seems to come around. It just gets tangled up in the busyness of our farming careers, and we just don't treat succession planning with the attention it deserves.
Yeah, and look, I probably, when we were chatting about this, John, and we were deconstructing the first episode we did on succession, is I think and again with affection, the oldies fall into 2 categories.
Yeah.
There's that, let's just say roughly 50 to 60.
Yeah.
And then I'd say the 60 plus.
Yeah.
And I would sort of characterise the 50 to 60s as being in that, we've still got, well, at least 50, we've still got miles left on the tyres.
Yep.
We've still got some things we want to achieve, but they've got the younger generation coming through, and they're in a unique point. Their problems, or where they are now, is going to be completely different to someone who's, say, 70, that's got less miles on the tyres and probably is looking for a solution sooner rather than later. And I think, so they're dealing with 2 separate different things. And so I'd like to start, if we can, John, can we start with that, let's just say 50 to 60, that have got the kids that are, say, in their 20s?
Yeah.
Why do we need to have a conversation with them right now? Because it's not urgent. The 60 pluses, it's like, well, we need to be doing something ASAP, whereas maybe a 50-year-old's looking at it going, I got plenty of miles left, let's have a conversation later. Why do we need to be speaking to them right now?
Yeah, exactly. They're probably saying to us, well, what's the rush? Why should we be contemplating having the conversation? And the simple answer is that if you don't, and you listen to the earlier podcast, you'll be in the later category down the track and you'll have less options. It's probably as simple as that. If you don't open that conversation up early and act and find out what each person in that business needs and desires and where they're heading and how they're heading, and you will end up with less choices down the track. Comes back to that podcast 24, the 2 golden rules for the older generation, whether you 40 or 90, is pay yourself first. Make sure through the whole process and the conversations you're having that you are the founders, it's your business at this point in time, and you need to be taking money off the table as frequently and as much as you can, I believe, to set yourself up for succession planning. So that's probably business. That's money out of the business, I'd suggest. You either buy a share portfolio, self-managed super fund, get that thing started, and then only then really do you have the ability to look at the business and say, okay, there's enough business left here to succeed to the next generation. That's a viable business. So the quicker you start the conversation in the 30s to 40s, the quicker you'll understand what both those things look like. If you start the conversation earlier, it'll give you a longer time to build up that wealth so you can transition out of the business and leave a viable business. If you leave it any later, you'll have restricted choices because most of your wealth will probably be tied up in the business, which now you're looking to hand over to somebody else, and you need to extract some kind of money, wealth out of the business. And generally, you'd probably be leaving, if it's on any mid-scale business, not a very viable business with a lot of debt, to an incoming generation.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's let's say 50. You've got 10 to 15 years. Let's just roughly. You've got 10 to 15 years to put a plan in place.
Yeah.
And with time, you can make a lot of changes. Like a lot can change in 15 years. Whereas if you've got
compound interest.
Absolutely. Yeah. Whereas if you've got 1 or 2 years or 6 months or 6 weeks, your choices really, as you said, become limited. And I think also too, as we said in the first one, if we're going to have tough conversations between mum and dad and the young'uns, it's better to do it when your kids are in their 20s or your adult children are in their 20s and you're in your 50s than when you're in your 70s and they're in their late 40s. There's going to be more family unhappiness or disharmony than if you'd done it earlier on. So
yeah, look, I say let's get back to the younger oldies. It's your responsibility, straight up. Don't expect your kids at 22 to come to you and say, what does the future look like? It is genuinely, I believe, your responsibility as the leaders of the family and the leaders of that business to start that conversation. There's no other way to put it. It's stump up, stand up, you the leaders, get in front of your family and get all of you understanding how you're thinking. Have that conversation. Where are your kids headed? Maybe they haven't a clue, and that's fine. Rather know they don't know what they want than think you know what they need. So, if they say, I don't know when we're going to come back, that's absolutely fine. Put some timelines in place. I say to the younger ones, you've got time, as you said, you've got 15 or 20 years. Put a timeline in place so that today is October 22. By next year, October, we need a decision or indication. Is Jack or Jill or Ben or someone coming back? And so use timelines. Make sure you put timelines in place and revisit this thing when you are younger. You can revisit it every year, every 6 months. Nothing has to be set in stone in the early phases. Just opening the door for the conversation to build trust and understanding as to where this thing's where it's going. And it comes back to the younger generation. Have the vision and goal. If you as the older generation don't have a vision for the business or preferred future, how on earth do you expect your incoming family to understand where this thing is going? It's just going to go whichever way the wind blows. And for most millennials, if that's what they're now called, that's not good enough. The younger generation needs clarity. They want information, and they need to be able to make their choices earlier in life, I think, than maybe we did as older generations.
Yeah, and I think there's also as we get older, we forget our indiscretions in our youth. And I'm going to give you a little quick story.
Yeah.
I remember chatting to a really great family. I admired them greatly. They were very successful and they had strong values and they'd raised some great kids. And I remember sitting down with Dad, this was about 5 years ago, and the young fella was off farm, getting an apprenticeship, really driven, working his guts out, and he was spending a lot of money And I don't think he was spending a lot of money, but Dad did, and it was causing a huge amount of friction in the family. And I remember I think he might have put a bigger bull bar on the Land Cruiser Ute or something like that. Money. And he's like, and this just caused so much disruption between Dad and son. And I remember I sat down Dad and I said, "Now, Dad, I understand where you're coming from. You're wanting to teach him to be responsible with money. Yeah. So when he comes back to the farm and he starts taking over this $100+ million farm, he's going to be sensible with
understands
with
the value of money.
Yeah, yeah. And I remember saying to Dad, I said, so, and he's like, he's never going to, he's wasting money. It's just in him. And I said, what was your first car? And he looked at me and said, why does that matter? And I said, tell me what your first car was. And he told me. And I said, did you ever do any modifications on that car?
Yeah.
And he looked at me and he had a bit of it. And he was in his, 50s, early 50s. And he just looked at me and smiled. And I said, yeah, exactly. Yeah. I said, so I think there's an element of you need to look back on your children and realise that, you want to apprenticeship and then you're wanting to bring them through and teach them values and business. But you also need to accept that they are young, they are learning and they're on a journey. And you need to accept that they're never going to be perfect in your eyes right from the beginning.
Yeah, and I think that's a hell of an important point. All of us have skills and passions, and your responsibility as the younger, older generation is to be the mentor for that incoming generation. Share your skill, admit the gaps, and as I say to a lot of the bigger families who I work with, you need to employ people who fill the gaps in your family's succession plan. You don't need to employ people who fill the gap that you're in, because that's where you fit in. So I see a lot of families falling into the trap of employing people who like me, who like Dad, and if he doesn't fit the mold of mum or dad, then that he's not valuable. You really need to be conscious that because it's a real business, you need to fill the gaps in the business with skill, not just the first person who walks through the door. So that's part of the conversation you want to have with your younger generation, your kids coming in, is tell them where the gaps in the business are. We need people who are more economically minded to drive this business forward. I've got the doing covered. We need you to upskill yourself in the economics or the finance of this business.
John, do you mind if I ask a question here, mate? I think there's a really important point. Something just triggered in my head. I remember we had this conversation once before, and hopefully you can remember the stats, but you said one of the important things is to what is it that the parents or the older generation, what is it they fear about their kids coming through? Because I think that's a really important point to address. What are they fearing?
Probably it's a range of things. One is that they don't have the skill, that they are going to, like the analogy of spending the money, they're going to come in and they're going to spend everything you've saved and they're going to blow it. The other fear that they come in with is that your son or daughter is going to get married and the in-law spouse is going to take it to the cleaners one way or the other. And I guess there are stories out there that have unfolded like that, certainly none that I've ever worked with, because you have the conversation up front. There's a clear understanding, and you put protocols and things in place so those eventualities don't necessarily take place. So, yeah, they fear. There's a lot of fear out there, and it's mostly unfounded because it's never been asked. If you have something that lives rent-free in your head, that's a fear. And until you ask the right questions or get someone to help you ask the right questions of those people, you'll never understand the truth behind that fear, because you've never really asked the right questions.
Because this is an important point for the younger ones listening to this, because again, I've encouraged, if there's any parents listening to this or the older generation, get your kids to listen, because this is, and it doesn't matter how old they are. If they're teenagers, get them listening to this to start. But it's understanding what mum and dad are fearful of. And my experience is they're fearful that grandparents have worked hard, they've built a big business, or they've struggled, and then all of a sudden they fear that the kids are going to come back and be spoiled, entitled, they're going to make bad choices in their lives, and they're going to blow it. Yeah. And a lot of the time that's unfounded, but that's their fear. And I think the spouse one is a really important point. My biggest advice is that I think the older generation should be absolutely instilling in their kids that your choice of spouse will make or break you. I think that's a really important one, and I've seen this over the years. There's been very few families I've seen successful that haven't had a good husband and wife team.
Yeah. Look, and we can't always plan for that, but if you have that genuine conversation up front and there's trust, there's communication, there's commitment. Sound like a marriage counselor, but those are probably the three things you're looking for to build the trust in the older generation. And the only way to what's the word I'm looking for? The only way to show that is demonstrate it is by leadership. Is that you need to introduce these people to the business and the family in such a way that it builds trust, and you need to find a place in that business for these people. Use the skills that the in-law children have. Don't just make them the bookkeeper, because that's as boring as you know what. But make sure that you use the skill of the incoming generations' families to build that business and be inclusive, not exclusive. We can't choose our children's partners and families, but we certainly can influence the way we interact with them once they have chosen that path, and support them, because I think it's a lot of the time it's lack of support that drives a wedge between the incoming generations' marriages and relationships. And I see that all the time. I see a wedge driven in by the older generation between the younger ones, which is very, very sad.
Yeah, and it just builds over time, doesn't it?
So the other things, when you're starting up in the young phase, is, let me rephrase it, the younger, older generation, the 40 to 55s, you might not even need a facilitator at this point. You might just need to have that conversation with the family that this is the path. As the leader of the family and the business, this is a very important aspect of our business, is to keep lines of communication open so we know where everybody is down the track. So you might not need a facilitator at that point in time. Having those informal meetings also just teaches the kids, your kids, the incoming generation, that this is part of how you have conversations, because it's never taught. I still have to work with a family where they've actually had communication education. They've had everything else, but not communication education.
But even just having a regular meeting, like if you have a regular family meeting with an agenda and you sit down, not around the kitchen table, I think you said in the last one, in mum and dad's kitchen table, somewhere hopefully slightly outside of someone's own home, and be able to have an agenda to be able to go through and say, okay, what are we going to discuss? So it becomes a regular thing rather than something that's something that's alien.
Yeah, and it's alien, and even more than that, it only happens when there's a disaster.
Yeah.
So we've learned that you're going to be called to a family meeting when
the shit's in the fan.
Not even about to hit it, it's well and truly in there and spinning. We want to stop that. We want to be on the other side of that. We want to be having the meeting when it's all going well. And I'll talk about that later. I say we want to be proactive, not reactive, and have a prosperity mindset, not a poverty mindset, because most of the conversations that I get called into have degenerated into poverty thinking. Whereas if you start early, it's a prosperity thinking. The incoming generation can see the future, they can get excited about it, but if it's left too late, well, then it's all about doom and gloom, and mum and dad about fall off the perch and how are we going to make this whole thing work. Whereas when you're 45, it's a completely different energy conversation that's going on. The younger ones, I'd suggest you start investing off farm, have your own super fund, and this is the older generation who just started. Every bit of money, and you can get off the farm. That's not needed there for growth. Start considering having an off-farm investment set up really early. Again, compound interest works for you. You start at 45, when you're 65, 20 years of compound growth on small numbers can become big numbers.
And that's where the financial advisor in me comes in, and I'd always say to people, you might have started putting into your off-farm assets when you're 40 or 50 or 55.
Yep.
Now's a perfect opportunity to get your kids doing it. Tell them the mistakes you made by not starting earlier, and get that habit built and that education built in then, so that when they get to your age, they're well ahead. Yep. And it's interesting, some of the most driven people I know is who had a hard succession plan, got it sorted, and then said, we don't want this to happen for our kids.
We'll never make that mistake.
No. So have a look around, and if it's happened to you, make sure you start preparing for your kids coming through.
Set up good family agreements, even at that young age, just so that the kids looking into the business know how they're going to come in, what the expectations are. Pay a realistic wage. So the 45-year-old, 50-year-old older generations will have these 25-year-old kids, 20 to 25-year-old kids. Pay them a realistic wage so they can start exactly what you've just described. So instead of earning $30 a day, they're earning $350 a day. They can start that compounding interest effect so that it creates and builds choices, not just for them. This is where I think people get it wrong. Why should we pay our younger kids $350 a day to muster? Because the business can't afford it, number one, or they're not worth it. But every cent you invest in them will ultimately end up investing in you when you want to get out, because they've built up this nest egg
and the habits.
And so there's less reliance on the business for them should they need to exercise choices, which very often comes to the cost of the older generation.
Absolutely. And look, I mentioned this in the last one, but there's different phases of this whole process. There's the under 30s, I call again, I'm for the lack of repeating myself from the last episode, but is the apprenticeship phase.
Yep.
So if you're in your 50s and you've got kids in the 20s, it's, I believe, incumbent on you to actually take those kids through an apprenticeship.
Yep.
And when I say apprenticeship, I don't mean driving the tractor, planting the crops, mustering the cattle. It's great to be good on farm, but there's a whole lot of skills out there that are just as important beyond the farm, so the business management skills. And a major mistake I see people make is they bring their kids into the farming business and just purely an operational level. They never let them into the books. They never teach them about how to deal with the accountants, the bankers, the mechanisms. And so when they hit 35 and they say, we want to take over, mum and dad go, oh, geez, I'm not really comfortable with young Johnny or young Mary taking over because they've got no bloody idea about how the business side of things work.
Yeah, I think the last thing for the younger oldies is start a conversation with your family so they start understanding how the asset is going to be divided up when you die. There's fair and there's equal, and there's everything in between what that might look like. But if your younger generation coming in knows that your wish is to divide the farm equally on a value basis, the younger generation coming in will have a very different view on how that should end or could end or will end. If they are thinking, okay, well, I'll come back and work and I'll get the lion's share or all of it, versus if they know straight up that your absolute wish and desire, and it's going to be like this, is to divide the 10 million by 3, and you're going to have to buy your brothers and sisters out. They need to know that really, really early in the piece.
Well, you need to work that out, because this is what happens is the ambiguity is you actually haven't thought through what you want to have happen.
Yep.
And the contention can be between husband and wife, in the sense that dad just wants to leave, let's just say, a typical one I'd see is dad wants to leave the farm wholly and solely everything to the son.
Yep.
And then mum's going, well, what about our other son or our daughters or could be a daughter on farm.
Yeah.
And so there's a contentious between the two. They need to work that out early on so they know what's going to happen. And I think from, again, the financial planner's point of view is you need to know what you need.
Yes, before you start putting too many thoughts and what's the word I'm after here? Before you put everything on the table, make sure you know what you're putting out there, because you can change it, but you don't want to go back on it.
You can cause a whole lot of problems if there's a miscommunication. And I think one of the important points I want to make, John, before we go on to the older generation, the older of the older generation, shall we say, is the last point is I like to use the words when, then. And I think this would be really good to deal with your adult children, 20s to 30s when they're coming through, is when this happens, then this will happen.
Yep.
And so I would be going back to your kids and saying, look, I've worked out exactly what we need. And as an example of one of the when-thens is I would like to retire off farm. We'd like to buy a house in town or on a smaller block or subdivide 100 acres off or whatever it might be. And I would like to have a off-farm assets totaling, let's just say $1 million.
Yeah.
You can then go back to the younger generation and say, when we've got that, then the succession plan will actually trigger.
Yeah.
And so then you can, as a team, work together and say, okay, well, we need to be able to get to a point where we've lowered the debt on the farm or we've built enough off-farm assets. So then the kids are working their guts out to try and get that outcome to get what they need. So then you're working together towards a cause. So when, then.
Yep.
I think it's a great way of putting it.
Yeah. And if the when, then doesn't stack up for the incoming generation and they don't see it ever becoming a when, we've got the 2 million or million, then they can make a decision up front as to whether they stay in or stay out.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, is there anything else we want to talk to the 50 to 60 before we move on to the, say, over 60 or 65s that are ready to do something right now?
Today's episode is brought to you by AgriCoach. You've worked bloody hard over the years and you've built a solid operation. But as your children grow up and start their own journeys, you're beginning to think about the next 5, 10, and even 15 years and how to keep driving the business forward and ensure a smooth and successful succession plan. Preparing the business, preparing the next generation, and preparing for your eventual retirement all requires a solid plan and a proven process. Unsure about the right steps to take? Head on over to agricoach.com.au/webinar to learn more about our Succession Proof Your Family webinar. AgriCoach, aligning families, growing wealth, and protecting legacies. And now, let's get back to the episode.
Just encourage you guys out there to start the conversation. I know it probably feels premature. It probably feels like it's not needed. Your kids are probably still running around at varsity and chasing cattle up in the Northern Territory and doing their sort of wild oats days. But set the scene, have it informal, get it started, and you'll be surprised how fewer conversations you'll probably have to have down the track. So no, but not much really. Just get it started. I know it sounds, a lot of people perceive it's a waste of money, waste of time, having this conversation that early in the piece because no one actually knows what the hell they want. And that's fine because that's what you want to know. You want to know and start instill that process in place. So it's a process rather than absolutes. When we get to the older generation, then we start getting to absolutes and time runs out on us. And pressure comes on and we start making poorer decisions, I believe.
And the next section we talk about will be really important to you because this is where you'll end up if you don't do the right things now. So
Correct.
Why, let's say we're 60 plus and you're ready for a succession or 65 plus, why are they stuck?
Probably because they think they're going to live forever. One of the major issues I pick up, and this is not just men, but particularly men, they do believe they're going to live forever and that nothing needs to really change. It's very hard to understand that your energy levels are slowing down and your enthusiasm might still be there, but often the enthusiasm goes as well. But certainly the energy taps off and you've got to be pretty aware, self-aware of that so you can make good decisions because they haven't given it priority. They haven't given it prior consideration and they've just something changes generally. Something as you're getting older, it's either a health issue, a death in the family, debt that becomes insurmountable, seasons that change. So quite often it's an external influence that affects your decision making. Whereas in the early piece, it's an internal influence that you can control. Whereas as you get older, a lot of the reasons you get stuck is because it's an external influence that's forcing you to do something that you're probably not ready to do at that point in time. As I said, left it too late, so you're running out of options. We had 10 options as a younger person. You've now maybe got one or two. You've made some poorer choices in the early piece that have changed the direction of your life, your business. So that's going to get people stuck. They just can't see a way out other than selling the farm or making some drastic changes. One of the other reasons people get stuck is because they've let business and family become intertwined and remain intertwined forever. And they haven't pulled this thing apart. So you've got the dog wagging the tail, or the tail wagging the dog, rather, and they just lose control. They just believe they're losing control. So if they do something, they're going to lose more control. So you generally just stay with the status quo. It's easier to not do anything.
So why are they worried about losing control, John, in your opinion?
Because their identity is wrapped up in what they do, a lot of them. So a lot of farmers I work with, their identity is so intertwined with what they do that the fear of not having that identity and stopping doing what they're doing is going to drop them into a big hole, and it sometimes does. The families I work with, we work really hard at creating a new identity or a new pathway for them to retire into. And my definition of retirement, as I said before, is doing what you want to do, not what you have to do.
Yep.
So if you can get your head around that I'm sure everyone we're talking to has dreams and aspirations. I haven't met anyone who doesn't. And if you can identify what those are, those dreams and aspirations, and create some joy and some fulfillment around one day being able to do what you want to do, well, that's retirement. You don't have to necessarily stop the farming. You just have to start doing the other stuff. And the more you start doing the other stuff, and fishing is a very poor example of living by the beach and fishing, because that's not sustainable. But it's some other desire and need that gives you fulfillment. That generally is what transitions people easily from active farming or active work to a different state. So it's the transition is more important than the event.
And so, is it your opinion, John, that there's usually some family disharmony that gets people at this age? There's the next generation coming through. There's not a clear path. There's stress. Is that a common theme?
Yeah, I think it is, Ben. The common theme is that at this point in time, your children are now 40s. Their lives have changed completely. They've got families. More often than not, the agitation comes from them rather than from the older generation. So that's what I'm finding more and more, is the agitation comes from them.
Why do you think that's the case?
Because broken promises, unrealistic promises made in the beginning that have never been fulfilled or explored, and that they need to get on with life. They and the older generation now. Your children are now young adults or midlife adults, and
they've got kids coming through.
Easily they'll have kids probably in high school by now. Even they've got boarding school fees. They've got the direction that they find themselves on suddenly isn't necessarily the direction that they thought they'd be on, and it's loosely termed midlife crisis, I suppose. Is you have worked all this time for something you thought that was going to end up in a certain fashion, and now suddenly your dreams have been shattered or not fulfilled, and you really start questioning, can I stay or should I stay or will I stay in this uncomfortable situation? And unfortunately, they have also now suddenly got a whole lot less choice. So yeah, it generally comes from the younger generation who are now 40 to the agitation comes from them while their parents are 60 and 70.
And in my experience, and I want to check if this is the same with you, John, are you finding that it's mum that usually is wanting change and it's dad digs the heels in and doesn't necessarily want change? Is that, I know there's exceptions to every rule, but do you find that's a common theme?
In the early pieces, I think it's almost exactly like it. I get 99% of my phone calls come from the mom or the lady in the family, the wife or partner, to say something's got to change. Because that's the maternal instinct, and they're more proactive. I'll be honest with you. They have got more proactive capacity to look at the family and not just the business. So the phone call almost always comes from mum, but in the meetings, it's very often dad who brokers or creates the solutions. Interestingly, because they haven't really ever explored these options, I don't believe, other than a very cursory conversation around a table somewhere. But now that they're sitting down, that you build some trust, you build some rapport, you give them a voice basically where they probably don't think they've had one before. You've got the family looking to them, or you, as the leader, as the matriarch, as the mentor of this business, and very often the older generation fathers are the very enlightened ones at the meetings I work with.
So what are some of the common mistakes people are making when they're where they are now? John, in that age bracket, what are the common mistakes they're making, mate?
Ben, I think it's the same as the previous one. They're working on assumptions. So they assume that their 40 and 45-year-old children, who are now mature adults, the they assume they know what they want. They assume that everyone's happy. They assume that the conversations are not taking place in the bedroom. And they just don't create that environment where it's easy and safe and proactive to talk about the things that are definitely there. And they're normally evident and, what's clear in plain sight, but they're just suppressed so that you don't have to go there because it's going to be a slightly more difficult conversation than what you expect. So, working on assumptions. And the other one is treating your adult children who, as I said, 40 and 50 as children.
Yep.
It's a real, it's a toxic environment out there where they still talk to them and about them as if they are kids and they don't have any influence in the building, in the business. They don't have a voice in the business, and that I don't know when that's. If I was that 40-year-old son, I wouldn't know how to go about broaching that subject because it's been one-way traffic all that long, and you just fall into a pattern of communication that is the path of least resistance. It's just too difficult to change that because it's been set for so long. So, you accept it and you just hope, which is not a great strategy, that something's going to change.
Because it's interesting. It's, in my experience, John, is let's pick on Dad for the moment. So Dad's generally bust his guts on the farm and wants to leave a farm behind.
Yeah.
Like that's my experience in general terms. They want to leave a farm behind like their father or father-in-law's left them. That's what they want to do. But by doing nothing, they're actually almost guaranteeing the fact that the farm's going to be sold. It's going to be lost, or at least significant wealth's going to be lost and significant family harmony. And for Mum, as a general rule, is Mum wants harmony. She wants her kids looked after. She wants the grandkids having opportunities. They want more choice for everyone involved and more family harmony. And what I normally say is the sitting around the kitchen table. They want to be able to sit around the kitchen table at Christmas and all get along. Why do you find that there's just this, it gets to a point where it just regresses and then nobody will take action or move forward? Is it just people get to the point where they just are conflict fatigued, or they just want to stick their head in the sand, or they don't see a clear path forward? What's your experience there? Why do you think it just grinds to a halt at that age?
Probably is leadership. It's one of the things that really does come up is leadership. Who is going to take the leadership role and make this whole thing happen? It is fatigue because we do hammer the dads and the men a little bit in succession planning, which is probably unjustified to a large extent. It's just that we don't have the skill set to deal with this stuff. So we've never been taught it. Not just men, but in general, people haven't. We don't go out there and actively look for conflict resolution courses and succession facilitation courses to go and attend. We'd rather go and learn how to select bulls or, class wool or something. So there is a lot of fatigue because the conversation, everybody knows it's going to happen. Everybody knows it should be happening. And I think the people who try and push it to make it happen eventually get tired and just say, bugger it. We've had so many cracks at this. I've had so many conversations with Mum or Dad. So we're just going to suck it up and hope for the best.
So is it okay to say, I've had enough, I don't care, they can all sort it out when I die?
Well, it'll end up, the consequences of that will be exactly probably the opposite of what you've always wanted. So yes, a lot of people say that. That's exactly how we're going to do it. We're going to keep going. And my advice then is to the younger generation is eject. Is if you cannot at any level get what you need, your choices are really, really limited. So it's not easy for people to eject when they're 40 and 50 years old, but sometimes it's necessary. So so all those things fall into place to create a very difficult conversation. Nothing's moving forward. We've tried to have a go at this over and over. The interesting thing is when they get a facilitator in. I've worked with families who've had 5 and 10 and 20 attempts at this, and big families, small businesses, doesn't really matter. When they get that independent voice or that independent reasoning into the system, a lot of the things they've thought were impossible become very normal. They just all the conflict gets deflected, and they start going to the root causes. And those are I'm trying to think of all the things that stop people having them. But time poor people will blame. They'll find every excuse under the sun not to have the meeting. And cost is one of them. So cost is, everyone says, oh, why would you spend $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000 on having a facilitated meeting in New South Wales, for instance? Well, the costs of not doing that, I can tell you now, are going to be way greater than the few $1,000s.
Yeah, well, back in the, I can't remember what number episode, with Kylie Wilson, who's a succession and an estate lawyer. And I remember her talking about a family that had, I think it was 5 kids, and anyhow, dad died. There was 4 kids and mum. And I think they ended up in a room with, and I think you were involved, John, at one stage, but I think it was 4 kids.
Lawyers.
And either one of them had a barrister.
Yeah.
And mum had a barrister, and they're all sitting in a room fighting over the estate. And they worked out that the bill would have come to about $1 million very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And it just was a disaster waiting to happen. So if you're at that age now, you're right. Like we've mentioned, you need to get someone to come in to help you. What else can you do, John, to get the ball rolling, to start, getting things moving?
Ben, if you're the older generation, that's 50 to 70-year-old.
Well, let's say you're right ready. Let's say you're 60, 65 to 70, and you're like, something's got to be, or even 80, something's got to be done.
Yep. Pick up the phone. I mean, I keep banging on this, but you need help, because if you haven't done it up till this point, the chances are that you're not going to just suddenly do it tomorrow because it's the right thing to do. Get help, get professional advice in to start, even at this late stage, picking, unraveling what has to be done, and just create momentum. It's an ongoing process. It's liberating. It's the most liberating process I find is for the older generation, who know they need to stop doing what they're doing, regardless of what the incoming generation's aspirations are. The older generation knows that they cannot keep this going at this pace forever. And they've never thought of what the alternative looks like. So very often when you have that first meeting, it's very liberating for the older generation to actually, possibly for the first time ever, to understand what it is that life after work could look like, and how fun that can be, and how positive rather than negative it can be. And that's the flip side of the doom and gloom, is that once you lift the lid on this, it becomes pretty exciting for both sides of the family.
Yeah. And I think the answer, there's a couple of things for me, is there's absolutely a clear path out of it. Doesn't matter what situation you're in, there is a path out. The second side is it doesn't matter which path you take, there's going to be difficult things to go through, and difficult conversations and difficult decisions to be made.
Yeah.
There just is. And it doesn't matter whether it's the easiest succession plan or the hardest in the world, there are going to be difficult conversations.
Yeah.
But what I can tell anyone who's listening now is, getting out the other side, you'll look back and go, geez, I'm glad we actually went through that. Because if you don't do it now, it's a bigger problem later, and it just compounds over time. So if you don't do something now, in 5 years it's going to get worse. It's never going to get any better. And to the dads listening, nothing will destroy your legacy more than leaving a shit fight for your kids to sort out once you're dead.
Yeah.
Okay. That's what you'll be remembered by. And to the mums is, if we don't sort this thing out now, it's only going to get worse over time. So your family relationships will continue to deteriorate. So, and you do need help to be able to make this happen.
Yeah, 100%. And, I have dealt with families just recently where the father or the mother, the older generation, says, well, if we can't come to a solution, we're just going to sell it. And that is completely an option. And it looks like the simplest one, until the 4 children sitting in the room, who in their 40s and 50s, say, not over our dead body are we going to sell the home farm. We want to preserve it. And, so what looks like a simple solution to the one is absolutely not a solution to the others. So you're going to have those, when I call them courageous conversations. So that's what a facilitator does. He allows that conversation to be had, and explore all those options. If you're not going to explore the options, well, you're never going to be able to take one.
Absolutely.
So yeah, just the older generation, the when you're right in the middle of it, is exactly what you said, Ben. If you want to leave something, plan to do that. If you don't plan to do it, you're going to end up, it's just going to be a shambles. And the only people who are going to make money out of that is the legal fraternity and the accountants and the estate and the government, basically, when you start selling and dividing things.
Absolutely.
Leave a wake of not necessarily shattered dreams, but certainly disgruntled family members. Sometimes, on the other side of the coin, the best thing for the family to do is sell the property. And when you get consensus around that, I've just had one, a multi-million-dollar business. They are selling the property in the next 12 to 16 months probably, and they're going to divide it, and they're all going to walk away with $8 to $10 million each, and it's going to set up 5 families, or 6 families on their own trajectory. No one wanted to come back and farm the current business, and I think that's a fantastic result. It's by mutual consent. It wasn't done because they got to the end of decision process. That was the choice after they explored all the other options, and selling was and has been and is going to be a fantastic result.
And one point I'd like to make in there, John, about selling the farm is what I foresee is a massive problem that's coming in the industry, is that there's obviously a lot of money tied up in farms, and there's more and more that are being sold for record prices, or let's just say tens of millions of dollars. And so families are looking at this and going, well, my kids don't want to come back, for example. That's happening more and more. So they sell the farm. And I had this conversation with someone recently, and they said, oh, my sons have gone off and got careers. They don't want to come back to the farm in this remote location with their wives. That's not what they want to do. We're going to sell the farm. And the farm was, worth $20 million. And I said, well, you're not going to sell it for probably another 10 years. You want to stay. Let's just say it doubles every 10 years. 20, that's 40 million.
Yep.
You sell it. Let's say you need, a couple of $1 million to retire on, or $5 million. That still leaves $35 million. Yep. You've actually now got a bigger problem with that than if you actually succession planned the farm, because now what do you do with that $35 million or even $10 million? What is that going to do for you? What are you going to do with that money, and how's that going to impact your kids and grandkids? Because a big chunk of money, if your kids or grandkids haven't been prepared to take over custodial ownership, could actually destroy their lives. And if you think about lotto winners, the number of people that win the lotto and then 5 years later are bankrupt, it's going to be the same in the rural community, these big chunks of money. So it's really important families also think about, if my kids don't want to come back and I'm going to sell the farm, I've got to succession plan that wealth.
Yeah.
Okay, not the farm, the wealth of it. And that's a bigger problem we've got to talk about in some form down the track. So, Look, John, we've well and truly gone over our time now for today, but that's been absolutely amazing. To cut it all off, how would you end? What would you say to the mums and dads that are listening in the what we call the oldies? Yeah. What would you have to say to them before we wind up?
Ben, I think to sum the whole thing up, there are 2 aspects, and they get muddled badly. And the one is the succession of the functional authority or the running of the business to your children, and the other one is the succession of the asset. And you've just briefly touched on the issues that come with the asset. I'd suggest and I'd encourage the older generation to ask their children what's important to them. And without exception, so far in my work, it's been the younger generation desires to get control of the functional running decision-making process of the business. It's not necessarily the asset. The older generation, if you're listening to this, you're probably thinking, how do I divide the asset up? And I can almost guarantee you the younger generation in the first instance is looking, how do we run this business jointly, and how do we transition the control and the management of the business? The asset comes later. It's an integral part of succession planning. But if the older generation is hung up on the dividing the asset up amongst 2 or 3 or 4 children or whatever it is, they're missing a huge chunk of the early piece, and that is dividing up how we run the business with the current people in it, so that it provides the mechanism and the vehicles and the conduit. You become the conduit to the transition rather than the blockage. So I'd encourage the older generation to look at the transition of the management of the business before they get stuck and hung up on the transition of the value and the final asset. They have to be done. They both have to be done well, but the first one needs to come first, and this asset comes second. And if you hold those open, engaging, facilitated conversations, you can start having that. You can start that process early.
Fantastic. That's some great advice, John. Well, look, John, thank you very much. How can people find more about you online?
Ben, I work from my little business called Grow More Biological, so it's John, John at growmorebiological.com.au. Look, please, there's a phone call. There's a phone number there, 044 988 7875. It'll be in the show notes, I'm sure. I've spoken to hundreds of people, so pick up the phone, call me. I will ask you then to email me so I don't lose you in the depths of my phone record books, and we'll have a conversation. First thing I will do is I'll have a conversation with you. That's my commitment to the people who listen to your podcasts, is I'll have a no obligation free conversation just to let you unwind or vent or explain or whatever it is to offload your situation, and then we'll go into a formal understanding of how I can help.
Fantastic, John. Well, as I said, I'll have those in the show notes. By all means, please share the podcast. If you're an adult and you're of the older generation, share it with the younger generation. Youngers, share it with the olders. Get it out there to as many people as you can and see how we can help. So thanks very much for your time, John, today. And yeah, we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Ben. I hope it makes a difference.
John has a huge amount of wisdom to impart, and I know I got a lot of value out of today myself. Now, if you got value, then if you could help a bloke out and share this episode with as many people as you can so we keep getting the Succession message out. We've almost 25,000 downloads on the podcast right now, which has absolutely blown my mind. And that's because people like you are kind enough to share the episode, which, again, I greatly appreciate. If you could also like or share on Facebook or Instagram or the other socials, that would be super helpful, and I'd also be super grateful. Now, if you've got any questions, comments, or feedback, drop me an email at ben@thefinancialbloke.com.au. Now, that's it for this week. I'll see you in 2 weeks' time.